It's pretty clear that the fight against ISIS is not over at all, but it is changing. So where is it headed next? With us to talk about that, Professor Boaz Ganor. He's the founder and executive director of the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism in Herzliya. Joining us as well from Baghdad is Colonel Sean Ryan. He's spokesman for Operation Inherent Resolve, that is the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us on the rundown. Colonel Ryan, let me start with you. Just lay sort of the lay of the land for us. Where is the coalition now focused on fighting ISIS?
We've been focused in the Middle Euphrates River Valley, and we started up in the Shisha area, and right now we're still clearing that entire area. Originally, first of all, it's a huge area. It's probably about 2,000 square miles, so it's a big desert area. We were going through there pretty quick with the Syrian Democratic Forces, but then we found out that ISIS had a lot of tunnels underneath. So what we've been doing lately is back clearing that entire area so we can destroy the tunnels and seek out any ISIS fighters that had been hiding if perhaps they had been driven over those tunnels. Right now, we're heading towards Hajin. That's where we see the fight going and hopefully ending with a lot of populace of ISIS fighters in that area. And one thing I want to mention is folks in these Hajin area, all they know is ISIS the last 4 years. Their kids have not been able to go to school for 4 to 5 years. There's no jobs, very little water, and very little medical support. So it's vital that we get down to these areas and make sure we get rid of ISIS.
Colonel Ryan, you've been working with local forces also in this fight. How is that cooperation going, and what is your understanding of what happens to those ISIS fighters in those areas that are taken by these local forces?
Well, right now in Syria, if those forces are taken, they're going to the different prisons that the Syrian Democratic Forces have set up in different areas. I went out to those prisons, and they just were refurbished, and they're very secure. Right now, though, of course, there's an issue with repatriating some of these citizens back to their countries. So that's being worked through the countries, through the State Department. But it's vital that these countries come and take back their citizens, because the Syrian Democratic Forces are not prison wardens, and that's not what they were set up to do. But that's where the fighters will go once they're captured.
Boaz, when you're following very closely the evolution of this fight against ISIS over the last 4 years, what's your take on that mix of forces? We've seen sort of changing alliances all the time. What are the implications of that going forward for the future of these countries?
Well, it's a very good question because what we saw in this evolution of war is changing efforts from place to place. We cannot refer to the campaign against ISIS as one whole. Practically, there are two different efforts. One is being conducted by the United States and its allies, and mainly focusing in Iraq. And the other one is being conducted mainly in Syria, and this is by what I would call the axis of evil, which is a combination of Hezbollah, Iran, Turkey, with the ongoing support of Russia. I have to say, with all due respect, and I do have a lot of respect to the American efforts, I think that the main factor that actually changed the situation in the field, definitely in Syria, but also had an impact on Iraq in this regard, is the activity of this what I call axis of evil. Russia, together with its allies, were not reluctant to use every possible measure and force. Some of them are measures that Western countries would never use, and doctrines that they would never use. But at the end of the day, it was very effective. The coordination between those two efforts is still quite problematic. All in all, yes, we see the decline in the military capabilities of ISIS, but ISIS didn't disappear. Definitely not from Iraq and Syria, and even more than that, didn't disappear in other parts of the world.
All right, really briefly, Colonel Ryan, that coordination, how tough is that to coordinate with Russia in this current battlefield, or not?
Well, we just have a deconfliction with Russia for mainly anytime we're going to do some air patrols or something like that. But besides that, we don't really talk to Russia we're really partnering up with the Syrian Democratic Forces to get rid of ISIS in that particular area that I mentioned before of Syria. So that's really our main concern.
Colonel Ryan, I want to go looking forward with you for a moment. Currently, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, there are about 2,000 American troops still stationed in Syria, dealing primarily with this threat. At what point does the U.S. mandate end? What do you think? What is considered victory against the fight in the fight against ISIS for the U.S.-led coalition?
Well, victory is when ISIS no longer has the capabilities to have a mass strike against anyone. As mentioned before, there's always going to probably be pockets of ISIS here and there, and we're seeing part of that now. But victory is a strong word. I wouldn't say there's any wins or losses. Us taking ISIS off the battlefield is definitely a win for us, but it's really stemming and getting their capabilities off the battlefield is really the main goal here. There's definitely not a date or a timeline for this. It's when the mission is complete, and then after that, we need to make sure that that area is stable enough to bring the populace back and then have the jobs and schools and all those type things come right after that.
Boaz, we heard Colonel Ryan speak about some of these imprisoned ISIS fighters being sent back to the countries where they came from. I mean, isn't there a danger here that ISIS is going to be just basically mutate or reconstitute itself into a more international terror group, somewhat along the lines that Al-Qaeda's been able to do?
Well, I think that the best suggestion I can give you, Caleb, and the viewers is think about ISIS as a balloon which is not full with air. And when you press in one side, then it's very elusive, and the air is going to the other side of the balloon. You press the other side, it comes in between. That's how terrorism works. This is how ISIS works. ISIS has suffered a big blow in the face in Iraq and in Syria. The American efforts led to that, the Russians' effort led to that, but the ISIS still exists and probably will exist in the future. Terrorism is evolving phenomenon. It's like a fashion. Fashion comes, fashion goes, and then another fashion comes back. The fashion a decade or 2 decades ago of the Islamist jihadist terrorism was Al-Qaeda. In the recent decade, the fashion was ISIS. Now what you are going to see is some kind of a battle on hearts and minds between those two elements, the Al-Qaeda element on one hand and ISIS on the other hand. And it's very interesting to see who's going to win. You had many elements that used to be loyal to Al-Qaeda all over the world, in North Africa, in Central Africa, in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia. And when ISIS became the new fashion, they turned their loyalty from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. Now some of them returning back to Al-Qaeda.
Well, Colonel Ryan, I want to ask you about that. We've seen, as Boaz is pointing to, history repeating itself over and over again, certainly here in the Middle East. What is the U.S.-led coalition doing to try and ensure that ISIS is not just going to mutate, to rear its head, to go underground, to come up in a different form in the near future?
Well, that's definitely a possibility. And again, it goes back to taking away their capabilities. Right now, we've done an amazing job at degrading their communication, their logistics, their supply lines. We know that they're very low on food, but one thing they still have a lot of is money. They basically ran through Iraq and acquired a lot of money, and of course they took the oil fields and things like that. But again, our goal is to help stabilize these areas, and once the public starts coming back and they have places to live and jobs to work and schools to go to, we've already seen where they're not allowing ISIS fighters back into their neighborhoods. They're calling local officials and they're saying, hey, we have 3 guys in this area. You need to come get them. And that wasn't happening before. So that's another goal that we have set.
All right. Well, certainly stabilization is an incredibly long road ahead. It doesn't take much more than just looking at images in Iraq and Syria to see the level of destruction and how far there really is to go into getting to that state that you described.